Henry Ashford here, inviting you to picture several thousand Roman soldiers in full armour, standing on the beach in perfect formation, and then violently stabbing the ocean. Yes, this actually happened, and no, the water did not stab back. If the mental image of disciplined legionaries sword-fighting incoming foam makes you smile, go ahead and like this video. Leave a comment telling me whether you think you could defeat a particularly aggressive puddle, and subscribe for more bedtime absurdities from history. You see, in the year 39, Rome had an emperor who did not believe in doing things halfway. Caligula had already treated politics like his personal stage show, but then he decided to expand his audience to the gods themselves. Neptune, ruler of the sea, became his next target, and what followed was somewhere between a divine declaration of war and the worst beach holiday ever planned. And as you will soon hear, the instructions he gave to his generals make every office memo you've ever hated look downright reasonable. Now, before we imagine thousands of Romans swinging swords at salt water, it helps to set the scene. Rome in the 1st century was not exactly short on drama. By the year 39, the empire had more marble statues than sense, senators who were essentially expensive furniture, and an emperor who treated statecraft as a private improv show. Caligula was the sort of ruler who woke up each morning with a new idea that made everyone else feel alarmed that he had woken up at all. The empire had just finished expanding into the farthest corners of Europe, and rather than resting on this extraordinary achievement, Caligula's brain apparently whispered, "You have conquered land. Why not try liquid?" It is never recorded whether anyone suggested he take up swimming lessons first. The coastal air was clean and briny, the Mediterranean glittering innocently in the sun, which makes the moment all the more amusing. Imagine a crisp blue sky, gulls circling above, and Romans arriving with their flags and drums as if Neptune himself lived in a beach villa just offshore. These soldiers had trained to fight Parthians, Germans, and assorted barbarians with pointy sticks. Their combat manuals sadly had no chapter on battling waves, and yet on Caligula's command the sandy shore became an official theatre of war. There is no surviving account of the sea offering terms of surrender, although one imagines the tide withdrew at its usual pace, which Caligula may have taken as a cowardly retreat. The central problem, of course, was that Neptune was not a land-based opponent. There were no vulnerable supply lines to cut, no forts to besiege, no carefully groomed enemy general waiting for an audience. Just endless water, eternally moving back and forth, making it impossible for soldiers to recognize progress. After hours of hacking at surf, the only casualties were the sandals of legionaries who discovered what wet leather really feels like. The official Roman report for the campaign is lost to history, but it is possible it consisted of the words, "got damp." And yet Caligula insisted on making the conflict appear victorious. He wanted a triumph worthy of Rome's might, some grand parade through the city to show he had humbled Neptune. This required an uncomfortable bit of theatre. Soldiers were ordered to collect seashells as spoils of war. Picture hardened veterans, men who had marched thousands of miles and seen horrors most of us cannot imagine, now hunched over the sand picking delicate shells as if auditioning for the first seaside craft fair. Historians have guessed these shells were meant to symbolize Neptune's treasures, or perhaps Caligula just liked having souvenirs because postcards had not yet been invented. At this point you might wonder whether the emperor was completely mad, or simply running the world's biggest team-building exercise with very low morale. We know Caligula enjoyed dramatic stunts. He built bridges of boats just to ride across them, He declared himself divine, and he nearly appointed his horse to high office. Declaring war on the sea fits neatly into this impressive pattern of questionable decisions. Some ancient sources hint there may have been deeper symbolic meaning, but let us be honest. If you watch several thousand men fight water, you're not analysing the symbolism, you're wondering who will towel off first. Still, there is something mesmerising about the image. The greatest empire of its era, disciplined legions who could crush tribes from Scotland to Syria, lined up like children scolding a tide pool. Caligula stood on the shore watching with regal seriousness, as though expecting Poseidon, sorry Neptune, to rise dramatically from the foam and beg for mercy. Instead, the emperor received precisely nothing in response, which in a way made this the most honest battle report of Roman history. Man shouts at ocean. Ocean does not care. And with that, the stage is set. Thousands of soldiers, a sandy theatre of war, and an emperor determined to punish a god by stabbing his property. Rome had faced problems before, from economic collapse to barbarian uprisings, but only under Caligula did the empire seriously attempt to deliver a military defeat to the concept of wetness. That, at its core, will be the story you're about to drift through. The night an emperor went too far, and the sea refused to even notice. Now, to truly understand how we arrived at the moment where elite Roman soldiers were ordered to wage war on salt water, we must gently rewind the scroll and settle into the 1st century Roman world. This was not the Rome of noble togas and well-behaved philosophers. This was the Rome of marble excess, gladiatorial blood sport as weekday entertainment, and emperors whose sanity was increasingly optional. The Republic had long since died, its noble ideals crushed under the weight of one-man rule and extremely dramatic family dinners. Power no longer rested with the Senate, but with the person who happened to command the most legions and could shout the loudest during public ceremonies without anyone objecting out loud. By the time Caligula came along, emperor was not just a title, it was a lifestyle. Son of Germanicus, beloved general and frequent statue subject, Caligula had been born into prestige with a plumed helmet already halfway on. His nickname, which means little boots, came from adorable military cosplay he wore as a child, parading around army camps in teeny sandals. It was cute then, less cute decades later when he had absolute power and used it to settle grudges with theatrical flair. After all, nothing says supreme authority like executing someone for mispronouncing a menu item. If you needed a picture of Rome's political ecosystem at this time, just imagine a very large, very expensive funeral procession that no one could leave and where the horses occasionally ran the show. Religiously, Rome was in a flexible mood. Official gods still held court in marble temples, but emperors had started sneaking themselves into the divine lineup, sometimes while still alive. Caligula, never shy about attention, decided he was not merely chosen by the gods, but was in fact one of them. Jupiter, Apollo, even Venus. He cycled through personas depending on the day and possibly the weather. He installed golden statues of himself in sacred places and made worshippers bring offerings to, well, himself. This form of self-funded divinity was not well received by everyone, especially those who associated godhood with thunderbolts rather than wigs and choreography. But most Romans were too tired or too terrified to object. After all, disagreeing with the deity could be hazardous, especially if that deity routinely threw dinner plates when upset. Culturally, the empire had turned theatrical. Victory parades doubled as propaganda, and architecture was as much about intimidation as it was about beauty. If you could name a building after yourself and fill it with giant inscriptions of your greatness, you did. Spectacle was currency. And in this environment, declaring war on a god was not necessarily the strangest idea. Neptune had long been acknowledged as the churning force beneath Roman naval successes, the salty spirit behind strategic shipping lanes and flawless beach vacations. But Caligula, convinced of his own celestial status, no longer saw Neptune as a helpful deity. He saw him as competition, and nothing tempered a Roman emperor's ego like sharing the spotlight with an invisible colleague who never returned gifts. Politically, things were messy. The Senate, a tired collection of increasingly decorative men in increasingly expensive togas, still held theoretical power. In practice, Caligula treated them less like advisors and more like stage props. He delighted in humiliating them, issuing puzzling orders and demanding divine honours while refusing to explain policy. It was a government held together by fear, performance, and sheer gall. Many senators began excelling at the ancient Roman art of subtle eye-twitching, which was perhaps the subtlest form of rebellion still available. And in this uneasy climate, few dared question the strategic value of marching an entire army to confront the sea. Let us not forget the army itself. Roman legions were the greatest military apparatus of the known world, famed for discipline, engineering, and the ability to build a perfectly straight road through absolutely anything. These were men trained to overcome hostile terrain, foreign languages, and uncooperative locals. They did not blink at scaling mountains or crossing rivers full of imaginative diseases. But they had not, until this remarkable moment in Caligula's reign, been asked to confront a large, shapeless deity known primarily for fish and seasonal storms. Military command was becoming something of a game show. Try not to laugh, lose, or remind the emperor that sea foam cannot be captured. In short, conditions were ideal for something deeply unreasonable to occur. An emperor with a fragile grip on reality and a firm grip on power. A fleet of soldiers accustomed to obedience. A senate reduced to a commentary team with no microphone. And the Mediterranean Sea, vast, indifferent, and entirely unsuitable for combat. Enter the war with Neptune. By now, the stage was set with the precision of a very expensive play, where the lead actor keeps rewriting the script in real time. Rome's obsession with imperial grandeur, combined with Caligula's personal flair for divine cosplay, created a kind of political weather system that made irrational behaviour not just possible, but expected. It was not enough to win battles anymore. You had to conquer concepts, and if your state religion already included gods with suspiciously human habits, then making war on one of them, perhaps over hurt feelings or late maritime favour, became a tragically logical next step. You may be asking yourself, was there any real provocation? What exactly had Neptune done to deserve this soggy confrontation? The answer depends on how fond you are of abstract motivations. Perhaps Caligula resented storms delaying his travel. Perhaps he wanted to showcase his unshakable dominance over the physical world. Or maybe he simply woke up that morning with a dramatic idea and no advisors left brave enough to say no. Regardless, the plan was clear. Neptune had erred, and Rome would now march, not into Gaul, not into Egypt, but to the shoreline. The absurdity was not commented on at the time, at least not in any documents that have survived. Everyone involved, from generals to water carriers, simply obeyed. They gathered provisions, polished armour, and prepared themselves to die honourably against low tide. It speaks volumes about the Roman military machine that it could take even this sort of directive in stride. Somewhere in the ranks, someone surely had questions. But the appropriate response to imperial insanity was not open complaint. It was better helmet buffing. And so they came. Soldiers, banners, and all the synchronized splendor of Rome's finest, walking toward the sea as if it were just another armed opponent. There was no laughter, no revolt, just a strange, sombre acceptance, like actors at dress rehearsal for a tragicomedy that somehow got state funding. And in this quiet absurdity, we find one of history's most telling details. The empire that once built aqueducts to conquer thirst was now attempting to conquer the water itself. What happened next? Well, that is where the foam hits the fan. But for now, just imagine the silence before the assault, the crash of waves, the gleam of polished swords, the deep meditative nonsense of men preparing to teach the ocean a lesson the ocean would immediately ignore. The morning of the great amphibious confrontation found Caligula in an excellent mood, which was always a sign of imminent danger. Draped in a cape reportedly sewn from the feathers of 500 flamingos, he reviewed his forces with the focused majesty of someone who had recently decided to model his battlefield posture on Jupiter riding a thundercloud. Witnesses noted that his chariot was drawn not by horses, but by panthers previously employed at the Colosseum snack pavilion. It made for an impressive scene, if you ignored the mild sedative required to keep the panthers from chasing infantry. Onlookers described the imperial gaze as serene, detached, and possibly unaware of where he was. Along the shore the soldiers stood at attention, trying very hard not to make eye contact with the sea. There were 6 legions in attendance, all of whom had taken solemn vows not to ask questions until they returned to Rome or died of confusion. The centurions gave stern pep talks, substituting phrases like "defend the Republic" with newer ones like "poke the waves" and "honor demands we make it flinch." Armor gleamed, flags fluttered, and beneath it all was the hushed tension of men attempting to look dignified while being ordered to stab foam. Morale was reported to be medium. The oysters were unnerved. Caligula began his war speech with the gravity required of any confrontation with a minor sea deity. He declared Neptune guilty of treason, failure to deliver calm weather on demand, and quite possibly conspiracy to tangle imperial hair. His proclamations, delivered in high oratory with occasional jazz hands, were recorded by scribes who had given up punctuation entirely. The emperor then lobbed a ceremonial spear into the surf to signal the beginning of hostilities. It landed about 8 feet away and was retrieved by a confused haddock. This naturally was taken as a sign of victory. What followed was less a battle, and more a prolonged group exercise in enthusiastic pretending. Trumpeters signalled the charge, and the Roman infantry advanced in flawless formation into 3 inches of salt water. The first line plunged their swords downward with controlled intensity, slashing the waves with all the tactical sophistication of men assaulting an extremely damp gust of wind. Behind them, support troops unfurled nets to capture enemy combatants, which in this case appeared to be sea foam and one particularly aggressive crab. All prisoners were given names. The crab was promoted. To ensure full representation, the general staff conducted formal rites of conquest. They planted standards in the sand, conducted blessings, and, according to one account, raised a small wooden altar dedicated to victory over miscellaneous deities. The ceremony ended with the dramatic offering of salted bread and wine, both of which vanished instantly when the tide came in. Caligula, undeterred, declared it acceptable collateral damage and raised his arms in triumph. A nearby seagull burst into applause, or possibly digestive distress. The campaign then entered its next phase, the gathering of trophies. Officers moved through the surf, instructing soldiers to collect seashells as proof of their valour. These were carefully sorted into categories such as enemy shields, aquatic spoils, and unusually pretty. Each shell was logged, numbered, and in some cases quietly discarded when nobody was watching. One legionnaire reportedly returned with an entire starfish, and spent the remainder of the march arguing with it about naval tactics. These trophies would later be paraded through city streets under banners reading "Victory over the Deep" and "Neptune yields." Not content with oceanic dominance, Caligula then commissioned the construction of a temporary watchtower facing inland, positioned to better guard against possible beach counterattacks. Architectural blueprints survive in part, showing measurements for a defensive moat around a tower which by all logic was already waist-deep in sea. Historians remain baffled. Some theorize it was a symbolic gesture. Others believe Caligula just really liked moats. Regardless, the tower stood for nearly 3 hours before being claimed by a stronger-than-average tide and one triumphant pelican. Meanwhile, back in Rome, whispers of the campaign trickled through the Senate like spilled wine at a tedious banquet. Senators greeted the news with expressions ranging from resigned amusement to deep concern hidden behind waxy smiles. The official decree declared victory and recommended a public holiday. This was followed by a decree unscheduling the holiday, after someone pointed out that no one quite knew what they were celebrating, or whether it was safe to throw parties while the sea remained technically undefeated. To prevent further disruption, a committee was formed to study the problem, which disbanded immediately out of fatigue. One particularly brave senator, Gaius Arrius Modestus, raised mild objections. His suggestion that perhaps resources might be better spent reinforcing real borders rather than abstract ones drew a sharp rebuke. Minutes later, he was reassigned to manage public sanitation in a neighbourhood entirely comprised of goats. His political career was described as washed out, much like the siege ramps they had attempted to build from driftwood. Nobody ever found out what those were for. In true imperial fashion, rumours flared that Caligula planned to next confront the wind. Harbingers included the sudden relocation of several large flags, the mysterious painting of a horse to resemble a cloud, and at least one speech praising airborne domination. This led to a series of quiet debates among civil engineers regarding the structural challenges of building forts on breezes. After much deliberation, they concluded that scaffolding made of ideas was generally unstable and retired early. Their pension forms listed existential disillusionment as a primary cause. Through it all, stocks of salted fish spiked in the marketplace, driven by patriotic citizens stocking what they believed were now national war spoils. Taverns renamed drinks with aquatic themes. The popular tavern song "O Neptune, you wily brine" topped the charts, followed closely by March of the Baffled Infantry. Children were taught to salute the ocean with respectful sarcasm. Historians later referred to this period as the Blue Absurdity, though others opted for simply Caligula's wet phase. Even the military reports from the campaign adopted a kind of weary poetry. One surviving dispatch reads, "The tide resisted, but we stood firm. Shellfish casualties remain within acceptable limits. Morale fluctuates with moon's distraction. The author, an officer named Publius Varius Saturninus, would later resign his commission to write haikus about cartography. His most famous work, Mapping What Cannot Be Held, is said to include an entire chapter on the futility of bayoneting waves. And so, the empire pressed on, undefeated by logic and profoundly unhindered by evidence. Caligula had proven his supremacy, at least in his own deeply mirrored reflection. The troops returned to Rome sunburned and damp, bearing nets of symbolic victory and one very confused octopus adopted as a mascot. The emperor was celebrated, the sea remained unchanged, and everyone quietly agreed not to mention it again if they could help it. It was, after all, just another day in Rome, where gods could be colleagues, emperors could be divine, and battles could be fought with elegance, discipline, and absolutely no understanding of tides. Needless to say, morale was mixed. The Third Legion, who had been promised bread, glory, and possibly some light pillaging in Gaul, now found themselves lunging at the brine with spears that were more accustomed to skewering Gauls, not foam. Centurion Marcus Plautius recorded in his report that only 18 soldiers suffered injuries during the battle, all of them due to slipping on seaweed. One tripped while saluting, another while dramatically yelling, and a third tangled himself in his own ceremonial cape, which had gotten unexpectedly soggy. Still, discipline was discipline. Soldiers shouted commands, assumed fight-in formations, and jabbed at the surf like nervous children forced to participate in interpretive dance. An auxiliary archer unit even released a volley at a particularly suspicious-looking wave, which turned out to be a manta ray. It was the most tangible victory of the day. Caligula later had it stuffed, wrapped in silk, and presented to the Senate as a warning. A warning of what precisely was never explained. By noon, the tide had gone out, as tides tend to do, and a cohort was dispatched to pursue it. They followed the receding waterline at a dignified march for nearly 4 miles, before a local fisherman gently explained the concept of tidal movement. Upon returning, the cohort was reprimanded for cowardice in the face of the enemy's retreat. One particularly earnest young officer insisted on drafting a treaty with the sea to prevent further hostilities. It was written on vellum smeared with olive oil and sealed with a sardine. And then came the spoils. Caligula, believing that victory demanded tribute, ordered the troops to collect seashells. But not just any seashells. He wanted symmetry, bright colouring, spiralled forms, a sense of aesthetic coherence. Naturally, this led to the establishment of a rudimentary shell inspection corps, manned largely by literary types and retired meter keepers. One particularly pedantic inspector refused to accept bivalves on the grounds that they lacked charisma. Wars have been fought over less. The shells were then packed in crates and labelled as spoils of war, to be paraded through Rome as proof of their triumph. From a logistical perspective, this was somewhat challenging. Sea air had not been kind to the crates, and several burst open mid-journey, releasing a cascade of crustacean-smelling glory into the streets of Capua. Local merchants, believing it to be a divine omen, began selling perfume labelled Essence of Victory. It did not sell well, but it lingers in a few antique cupboards to this day. Back at the front, Caligula declared a day of triumph. He donned a seagull-feathered cape, possibly real, possibly conceptual, and rode along the coast in a chariot drawn by 4 white stallions who had absolutely no idea what was happening. Trumpets sounded, banners were raised, and there was an awkward moment when a confused dolphin swam too close to shore and was briefly appointed an admiral. It was released eventually with full honours and a small pension. Not to be outdone by Neptune's potential counterattacks, Caligula also commissioned a line of defensive watchposts along the coast. These were to be manned day and night in shifts by squads trained in aquatic siege response. Mostly this involved holding spears and looking meaningfully at the water. One unfortunate sentry misheard a passing gull and launched a false alarm, leading to 12 hours of frantic shell recounting and the accidental drowning of 2 ceremonial flags. The Senate by this stage was politely losing its mind. A delegation was dispatched to speak with the emperor and discreetly inquire whether any treaties with the sea were in discussion. Caligula, looking quite tired and perhaps slightly pruny, informed them that peace was conditional on the ocean's full surrender. This included the voluntary forfeiture of all tides, fish-related taxes, and a formal apology from Poseidon, preferably carved in salt. Back in Rome, poets struggled to keep up. Odes were written to the braveness of salt and the ephemeral loyalty of barnacles. A play debuted at the theatre of Marcellus titled Foam Without End, which featured a tragic love story between a Roman general and a puddle. Critics found it lacking in dramatic plausibility but praised the hydrological accuracy. Meanwhile, word had spread beyond the empire. Gauls, understandably confused, sent an envoy asking whether they too should arm themselves against the Atlantic. In Parthia, a group of astrologers reinterpreted a passing comet as Neptune's flare of distress, and began offering spiritual oceanic protection for a modest fee. A few merchants from Alexandria tried exporting Mediterranean kelp to Rome, branding it as the sea's remorse. It was stolen en route by pirates who mistook it for currency. Speaking of pirates, this entire spectacle inadvertently disrupted several established smuggling routes. No one had warned the Corsican coast pirates that Roman legions were now stabbing the water. One ship captain named Lysanias wrote in his diary that he lost 3 crates of illegally dyed tunics to a phalanx that mistook his wake for an amphibious assault. He grudgingly admitted it was the most theatrical customs inspection he'd ever seen. As weeks slipped by, the line between military action and performance art grew thinner. One cohort was seen practicing synchronized splashing at dawn while chanting in Homeric Greek. Another spent 3 days constructing a siege tower out of driftwood and despair, which collapsed spectacularly when a crab pinched the lead builder. That crab was briefly worshipped as a deity and offered a sacrificial fig, which it ignored. Then came the matter of the War Trophies Commission. Someone in Caligula's court, possibly one of the more satirical scribes, had suggested that the conquered waters be symbolically taxed. Logistical teams were deployed to collect buckets of seawater, which were carefully counted, catalogued and labelled according to region, scent and mouthfeel. The process took 2 weeks and resulted in the accidental salination of several olive groves. At the end of this ill-defined campaign, Caligula held a formal ceremony to thank his troops for their service in the Aqua campaign, as it was now being referred to in somewhat tentative bronze lettering. Medals were issued shaped like scallop shells and bearing the inscription, Victor of the Undulating Province. Needless to say, historians have never quite agreed on what that meant. And somewhere out there, in some forgotten archive beneath layers of dust and bureaucratic melancholy, there likely remains one tallied list of the Empire's brief, glorious, and profoundly soggy conquest of the sea, filed, as always, under miscellaneous. Morale among the troops, unsurprisingly, was mixed. Some were confused, others quietly furious, and a small but notable contingent was deeply invested in their new role as aquatic conquerors. One centurion reportedly fashioned a helmet from driftwood and claimed to have personally captured a saltwater spirit. He named it Jeff and kept it in a bucket for 3 days before releasing it back into the surf with full military honours. The ceremony involved 2 trumpet blasts and a short poem in Sardinian, which none of the officers understood but all agreed was very moving. Meanwhile, Caligula was not yet satisfied. Claiming the campaign had been a resounding success, he declared the coastline a new Roman province. He called it Neptunia and immediately appointed a governor. The position went to a man named Gnaeus Piso Euclides, who was blind in one eye and reportedly allergic to clams. His main duties included sitting in a tent on the beach and issuing decrees to passing seagulls, 2 of whom were eventually listed as honorary citizens. Treasury records from that year note several line items related to the maintenance of territorial dominance over the swells, including 63 gold denarii spent on custom sandals for walking ceremonially along the surf, and an additional 12 for a harpist hired to play during tide reports. The harpist quit after 6 days, citing workplace ambiguity and one incident with an octopus that no one really understood, even at the time. Word of Rome's war on the sea began to spread, mostly through confused letters home and anxious messengers who were not sure whether this counted as a military secret. In Gaul, a regional commander thought the reports were some kind of code and sent back plans for a counter-invasion against river trout. In Egypt, a scribe attempted to translate Neptune's imagined reply into hieroglyphs, but ended up accidentally inventing a verb that means falling asleep while proud. Caligula, intoxicated by his own lunar logic, began expressing concern that other natural phenomena might be plotting rebellion. Clouds were watched carefully, trees were interrogated. A pine near the Appian Way was arrested for suspicious leaning. The pine remained silent, which made it all the more damning. A tribunal was assembled to assess the matter, and a legal scholar named Marius Forticulus was called to interpret its droop as a seditious slouch. In this atmosphere of architectural paranoia, a new figure emerged. Her name was Agrippina the Younger, Caligula's sister. Having grown up in the absolute royal chaos that only an early Julio-Claudian childhood can provide, she greeted her brother's hydromania with the tired amusement of someone who had once seen a priest dedicate a pig to Jupiter in the Forum baths. She asked him, mostly for form's sake, what he planned to do if the sea ever retaliated. Caligula, without missing a beat, ordered the construction of a warning system. It consisted of ox horns lashed together with frayed rope, mounted on wooden staves spaced precisely 19 steps apart along the shore. The idea was that if the sea approached in anger, one of the horns would sound an alert. In practice, it just meant every high tide triggered a sort of mournful cheer across the coastline, accompanied by wet pelicans and increasingly traumatized watchmen. Of course, in Rome itself, the daily news moved on with the measured chaos of any capital city where the Senate fears being turned into horses. Senators still gathered and whispered, gladiators still fought, bread was still distributed, though one report notes that for a brief period fish also featured prominently among the handouts, possibly part of a national rebranding. The coins distributed with this fish inscription featured Caligula, giving the peace sign with one hand and raising a sea sponge with the other, a move later historians would call troublingly interpretive. Back on the shore, Governor Piso Euclides had come to enjoy his strange assignment. He took up whittling, built a modest collection of seashells that he named alphabetically, and began writing a travel guide titled Neptunian Etiquette, Surviving Life at the Edge of Empire. It included helpful tips such as not antagonizing crabs and how to bow respectfully to foam. Unfortunately, the scroll was later eaten by an escaped goat, which was itself claimed by the sea 3 days later, in what officials determined was a karmic offering. Ships that passed near the Neptunian coast were now required to salute shore patrol. This involved raising a banner of sardine bones tied with blue yarn, which often fell apart mid-gust, leading to several diplomatic incidents with Mytilene, and one awkward apology involving a fruit basket and 30 trained gulls. Trade suffered briefly, though some merchants managed to turn a tidy profit selling oceanfront shields, standard issue, plus waterproofing and a light incense compartment. Amid all this, Caligula held public games to celebrate the victory over Neptune. There were mock battles, dramatic reenactments of wave stabbing, and a rather confusing interpretive dance involving 12 flamingos and a man dressed as a reef. The crowd was unsure whether to applaud or start a minor revolt, but the imperial cake distribution that followed won most hearts, especially the lemon coriander slices, which were considered quite progressive at the time. Then came the poets. Oh yes, the poets. Sensing a cultural moment, they arrived with tablets and metaphors in hand, writing pensive elegies to drowned ambitions and sonnets to the nobility of barnacles. One particularly popular recitation was titled Wet Triumph, a sweeping epic that tried to rhyme trireme with esteem, and was hailed as both terrible and daring. Copies were passed around forums, read aloud in wine shops, and occasionally used to mop up spilled garum. So the empire, bloated and baffled, floated onward. Governors sent reports that read like fever dreams. Ambassadors brought seaweed as tribute. One senator proposed a law preventing clouds from gathering without a permit, which was narrowly defeated due to wind, and the sea, eternal and undisturbed, continued to roll in and out, mocking with every rhythmic sigh the fragile glory of men who once thought they could conquer it with spears and legal paperwork. Some say that by the end Caligula had forgotten what victory meant, or perhaps never cared. Others believe he found comfort knowing there was something he could claim without risk of rebellion, taxes, or political intrigue, only foam. Either way, he soon turned his gaze inward or upward, depending on how one interprets the next phase of this increasingly sopping tale. But that, dear listener, will lap against our ears a bit later. For now, it is enough to know that in the annals of human ambition there was at least one moment when a god was challenged, the sea was stabbed, and Neptune himself may have raised an eyebrow before going back to sleep. Undeterred by this rather damp defeat, Caligula returned to camp soaking wet but spiritually victorious. He declared the campaign a triumph and demanded a parade in Rome to celebrate this win over Neptune. Not wanting to ruin the mood with logic, the Senate agreed, and soon the city was preparing to honour a victory that had occurred entirely against foam and metaphor. Banners were hung, mint was strewn along the Via Sacra, and one confused blacksmith was commissioned to forge a ceremonial anchor out of solid gold. It weighed nearly 90 pounds and required 4 slaves to lift, which Caligula interpreted as a favourable omen. Naturally, the triumph needed prisoners to parade through the streets, but since the sea provides few volunteers, the emperor had a bold solution. Dress up some of the army's shortest conscripts as aquatic hostages. So it was that Rome witnessed the breathtaking humiliation of 6-foot soldiers in glued-on fish scales, shackled together with kelp, and looking very much like they regretted every decision that had led them here. One of them, Marcus from the 9th Legion, later opened a bakery in Gaul and refused to sell anything remotely salt-flavoured. The evening before the triumph, Caligula insisted on holding a dress rehearsal. This involved testing the balance of a chariot powered only by dolphins. Unfortunately, dolphins are not fond of cobblestones. The parade practice ended when the absurd contraption slid into a public bathhouse, frightening several naked senators and a visiting merchant from Antioch who had just learned what a Roman backscrubber looked like. The dolphins were eventually released back to the Tiber with full honours and 2 laurel wreaths apiece. One would later be spotted in the harbour of Ostia, wearing its crown with what seemed like theatrical disdain. On the day of the parade, crowds lined the streets in cheerful confusion. They tossed rose petals, cheered, and did their best to ignore the part where the triumphal chariot was followed by 60 wagons filled entirely with sand. Caligula personally narrated the procession from atop a mechanically rotating platform, also made of gold, which rang like a bell each time the wind shifted. He praised his conquest with phrases like strategic wetness, martial puddling, and the glorious humiliation of Poseidon's storm bureaucracy. The meaning was unclear, but the grapes were free, and so no one asked questions. After the parade, festivities continued at the imperial palace, where Caligula unveiled his latest innovation, the Department of Ocean Affairs. This consisted of 3 senators, a lobotomized flamingo, and a man from Naples who claimed he could speak dolphin, though this turned out to be an elaborate whistling defence against tax audits. Their primary duty appeared to be the strategic placement of anchors along the Tiber, which did little to secure Rome but did make swimming a rather more virtuous endeavour. Of course, not everyone was happy. The Praetorian Guard, already tired of explaining military logic to a man who believed he could turn seawater into diplomacy, began exchanging weary glances. Their leader, Cassius Chaerea, once cracked 2 ribs, stifling laughter when Caligula announced his plan to declare war on the moon for reflecting unauthorized light. By now he had started keeping a notebook titled Events That Have Made Me Consider Becoming a Farmer. It had 16 entries, all involving mollusks. Meanwhile, diplomatic envoys arrived from Parthia and Germania, eager to understand whether Rome had truly conquered the ocean or was simply struggling with metaphor. They left 5 days later, more confused than when they arrived, bearing strange parting gifts. 1 starfish preserved in myrrh, a tiny bust of Caligula made entirely from driftwood, and a seagull with a laurel tied around its foot. According to Pliny the Elder, one of the Parthians would not go near water again for the rest of his life, reportedly blaming something called aquatic rhetoric. Back at court, chaos continued to swirl. Caligula, flush with confidence and quite possibly salted to the gills, began commissioning a naval orchestra composed entirely of conch shell players. The group performed operas allegedly taught to them in a dream by Triton. Their debut concert near the Colosseum was drowned out by passing ox carts, but received polite applause from drunk senators who were unclear whether this counted as treason. The principal conch soloist, a man named Gaius Quinctilius, later became Rome's first known tinnitus saint. Then came the floating temples. Yes, Caligula ordered the construction of mobile shrines to Neptune attached to gondolas. These were dragged along aqueducts at sunset, the emperor waving solemnly while priests lit incense and accidentally set fire to 4 ducks. A 5th duck survived, was named Pontifex Quacimus, and received a pension equal to that of a junior tribune. It later retired to an ornamental pond and was worshipped by children who mistook it for a soggy minor deity. In late summer, an edict was issued requiring every citizen living within 2 miles of the coast to offer at least one compliment per week to the sea. These compliments could be whispered into mussel shells and delivered via designated compliment bearers, who are mostly retired librarians looking for a bit of walking. Offences included shouting at waves, making rude gestures toward the foam, or allowing sand to form coarse metaphors. Punishments range from civic lectures to mandatorily attending eel poetry readings, which were supposedly quite moving. Across the empire, confusion gave way to imitation. In a remote village near Cartagena, a provincial governor staged his own sea battle in an olive oil reservoir. 4 goats were dressed as pirates, and 2 locals drowned in 4 inches of grease. Meanwhile, in Britannia, news of Caligula's marine conquest energized a group of druids who began holding ceremonies to appease puddles. One altar was discovered in the ruins of an Iron Age hut, inscribed with what historians believe translates to "for the glory of moist ground." And still, Caligula wasn't finished. He now began referring to himself as conqueror of currents, and insisted that senators address him with a ceremonial splash. This involved flicking a goblet of water toward his feet with neither malice nor joy, a requirement that proved remarkably difficult for men who secretly desired to drown him in the Tiber. Senate records from the era show a notable rise in absences due to sudden dehydration or strategic fainting during hydration votes. At last, the absurdity reached a kind of fevered dream made flesh. Caligula hosted a gala on a specially built barge so large it was mistaken for a palace that had decided to float. The vessel, christened the Imperial Wave, bore gardens, a swimming pool, and what may have been the first recorded water slide. Unfortunately, it curved directly into a crocodile enclosure. 4 guests were eaten, but as the emperor explained, their sacrifice pleased Neptune, who had finally agreed to a truce, signalled through a suspiciously timed change in tide and the sudden appearance of a smiling dolphin. Some say the dolphin winked. Others say it simply had a lazy eye. Of course, whether any of this made Rome stronger, wiser, or even cleaner is anyone's guess. But by the end of the season, the seashells were polished, the trumpets shaped like fish had mellowed, and the empire found itself drifting calmly towards something even stranger. The conquest of water, after all, was only the beginning. The seashells proved difficult to catalogue. Some commanders, mindful of imperial expectations, began classifying them by perceived rank. Common mussels labelled as infantry, scallops as officers, and one oddly shaped conch summarily promoted to admiral. A pragmatic centurion named Gavius suggested that perhaps they should fabricate a few enemy banners for the official victory parade, which led to 2 full legions spending an entire afternoon dyeing kelp and sewing it into flags. Unused tunics were repurposed as standards of the so-called oceanic resistance. By the evening, they had accidentally created the first naval cosplay in military history. Caligula naturally was pleased. Not that he inspected the results. He simply heard the word victory and assumed the gods had conceded defeat. As a reward, he declared a new holiday, Triumph of the Tritons. It was to be celebrated annually with ceremonial swimming and dramatic retellings of the Siege of the Shallows. Young patricians began rehearsing interpretive splashings for the occasion, while elderly senators considered faking injuries to avoid involvement. One unfortunate fellow claimed his toga was allergic to salt water, which caused a minor scandal in the Vestal bathing community. Meanwhile, in the provinces, word of the campaign trickled in slowly, carried by befuddled messengers and even more confused traders. A grain merchant returning from Gaul reported that the Roman navy had been seen attacking a sandbar near Marseille. Another swore he had witnessed a cavalry charge into an estuary, which resulted in 30 horses refusing ever to face west again. The governor of Hispania sent a polite request asking whether he too should declare war on puddles, or if that authority remained exclusively imperial. The response, written hastily on dolphin-hide parchment, was both affirmative and vague. Back in Rome, the consequences of Neptune's defeat began to manifest in strange ways. Fishermen grew anxious, unsure whether they were now war profiteers or prisoners of war. One group insisted on paying respects to the captives before hauling in nets, addressing the fish as brave fallen foes. Fish prices briefly quadrupled until someone realized tilapia were not mentioned in any known pantheon. This led to the great mackerel debate of 39 AD, in which two philosophers duelled using pickled herring. Neither survived the indigestion. Caligula, ever the innovator, soon established a diplomatic bureau for ocean affairs. Its office was built entirely from driftwood and was staffed by poets rather than clerks, on the logic that the sea was moody and required sensitive intermediaries. The chief envoy, a man named Marcius Lento, took his duties seriously. He wrote daily odes of regret and power to the tide, addressing them to his watery majesty of the mostly unstable depths. At one point, Marcius tried to send a peace treaty in a bottle, which promptly washed up in Ostia with a dead crab inside. The crab was declared a spy. Cabinet meetings became difficult. Every discussion about infrastructure was interrupted with updates about aquatic morale. The city treasury began allocating funds for Poseidon appeasement, a line item which included pearls, oars, and 3 harp players hired specially to perform lullabies to the sea from the docks at sunset. At least one senator questioned whether bribing a mythological concept might set troubling precedents. He was gently told to reconsider unless he wanted to face trial for oceanic heresy. The public, long accustomed to spectacle, adapted quickly. Enterprising vendors began selling sand commemorative coins, which crumbled at the touch but were considered spiritually authentic. Children played Siege the Wave in alleyways, yelling slogans like "For Rome and the Low Tide." Theatres premiered a popular satire called Neptune's Last Stand, featuring a mop in a toga and a surprising number of eels. Even priests joined in, creating new rites to honour Selastia, Neptune's consort, by whispering gossip into clams. It was all very solemn, but not everyone was amused. The Navy, which had watched this sea-based fiasco from a respectful and increasingly horrified distance, drafted a formal memo reminding the Emperor that they, not infantry, typically handled marine engagements. Caligula responded by promoting 2 bridge builders to admirals and assigning them to supervise coastal obedience training. One promptly retired to the countryside to raise goats. The other attempted to build a floating amphitheatre and was last seen drifting toward Africa with a flute player and 6 confused geese. Meanwhile, Neptune remained notably silent. This lack of response infuriated Caligula. He declared the god contemptuous and possibly treasonous, and issued an edict forbidding all storms within a 2-mile radius of any Roman harbour. Curious thunderstorms immediately congregated outside the city in what may have been nature's first recorded protest. Overwhelmed, the augurs started reading omens in wet laundry and droplets on marble. At least one claimed to have seen Neptune's profile in the foam of a half-spilled amphora of wine. As these tides of absurdity lapped higher, practical consequences began to seep into overlooked corners of the empire. In Alexandria, where tides were more political than literal, a school of scholars attempted to realign their maritime curriculum to keep pace with Rome's sudden vendetta against water. One professor suggested reclassifying rivers as enemies in retreat, while another argued that aqueducts needed war medals. Students, already confused by Socratic logic, simply stopped asking questions. Enrollment surged, and yet, underneath all the pageantry, a quiet concern began to rise. Storms grew weirder. Winds began arriving from oddly specific directions, like north-northeast and sulky. Tides ignored standard schedules, leading to a particularly embarrassing incident in which the imperial bathhouse was momentarily evacuated by a rogue surge. Caligula interpreted this as another challenge and ordered the construction of a lighthouse entirely out of mirrors so the sea could be forced to confront itself. The lighthouse's completion revealed an unfortunate side effect. Ships redirected by the intense glare began colliding in unnecessary enthusiasm, creating what historians would later refer to as the Bermuda Confusion, though it was mostly confined to the Adriatic. Nevertheless, Caligula insisted it be logged as an aerial raid. When asked why aerial, he remarked cryptically that clouds were simply water spies in disguise, and thus, with the tenuous triumph growing increasingly damp around the edges, Rome found itself knee-deep in metaphorical undertow. Senators tiptoed around puddles with more respect than they offered each other, and a small but determined cult arose claiming that Caligula's actions had broken the ancient pact of balance between the land and the surf. They called themselves the Sons of the Silent Current, wore robes sewn from seagrass, and refused to bathe as a sign of loyalty. Their odour was political, their message deeply confusing. By early spring, a delegation of Gallic traders arrived bearing pearls and a note of cautious apology, having heard rumours that Rome was now the overseer of aquatic behaviour. Caligula accepted the gift and claimed full control over tide schedules across the western coast. A bizarre calendar was issued, featuring phases like mildly ambitious swell and emotional riptide. Farmers in inland villages began reporting dew formation violations, and somewhere, miles from any shore, a solitary ex-scribe sketched these updates into the corner of an old naval logbook, wondering quietly whether the empire had always been this strange, or if something particularly surreal had simply washed ashore and refused to leave, and so, having bravely declared victory over the sea, Caligula's troops returned to Rome in triumph. They were sunburned, wind-chapped, and carrying bags of seashells with labels like Mission Neptune Coastal Theatre. One officer, a centurion named Decimus Rutilius, insisted his was a rare scallop taken hostage near modern-day Boulogne. It was later found to be a pebble glued to a clamshell, but promotions were scarce, and imagination paid better. The spoils of war were paraded through the streets, waved gently atop spears like damp battle standards. Caligula, indulging his flair for spectacle, wore a helmet made entirely of eel skin and delivered a victory oration to a confused crowd. He declared that Neptune had been put in his place, and that the Mediterranean would, from this day forward, be taxed in fish. He then sneezed, blamed it on Poseidon, and exiled his own doctor. The doctor, incidentally, was 15 years old and had once won a school poetry contest. This was considered good medical training in certain parts of the empire. but divine vengeance moves in mysterious, if leisurely, ways. Within weeks, Rome began to suffer a slipper crisis. Thousands of military sandals, waterlogged from beach combat, began to rot from within. Soldiers complained of wet toes and philosophical despair. A disgraced shoemaker named Publius Claudius Fuscus saw an opportunity and introduced the first known line of aqua combat optimized footwear. It featured reinforced soles, waterproof leather, and regrettably coral flourishes. The campaign did not catch on outside of Capri, though Fuscus did briefly become the emperor's minister of walking. Naturally, all this had administrative consequences. The Senate, which had not been consulted on the War of the Tide, felt suddenly adrift. Literally, in one case, a Senator Cornificius stumbled off a dock during an impromptu inspection of the conquered shore, and became the first legislator in Roman history to be bitten by a jellyfish during official duties. He afterward introduced a bill formalizing Neptune as a hostile foreign entity, though the wording suggested he believed the jellyfish had diplomatic immunity. Meanwhile, the sea, having not noticed any of this at all, continued to lap calmly at the coasts. But inland, the court grew restless. Caligula, unsatisfied with conquering only one element, began hosting brainstorming sessions for possible skirmishes against fire and air. His advisers, now well versed in the mechanics of agreeing politely to things they didn't understand, nodded sagely and took notes on scrolls that were, in reality, wine-stained menus from the imperial kitchen. One general began practicing flanking manoeuvres against candles just in case. Into this dreamscape wandered a new figure, Livia Stalina, a self-declared prophetess of the Tiber, who claimed she had seen the gods whispering to the storm drains. She was particularly respected because she wore a helmet full of parsley and had once correctly predicted a minor landslide in Etruria. Caligula summoned her immediately and demanded a weather forecast. She responded by drawing a map of Sicily and honey and chanting the names of obscure mollusks. This was interpreted as a sign to build more boats, and so more boats were built. These were no mere warships, but floating temples, each dedicated to a different misunderstanding of aquatic theology. One barge contained nothing but mirrors to outshine sirens. Another was crewed entirely by actors trained to impersonate dolphins. A third was filled with olive oil in the event Neptune needed softening up. Citizens along the Tiber watched this surreal armada glide past with a mix of awe and cautious eyebrow-raising. Not all reactions were enthusiastic. In a small village outside Ostia, a group of retired sailors formed a union to protest the fictionalization of maritime tradition. They issued statements using driftwood carvings and demanded insurance coverage for imaginary tridents. The Imperial Bureau of Aquatic Affairs filed the complaint under mythological grievances and forgot about it the next day, after a minor crisis involving a feathered statue of Triton that had started attracting gulls. Still, there was a growing sense that history had slipped its tracks. Even the priests of Jupiter, long accustomed to divine melodrama, began carving extra question marks into the margins of their scrolls. One high priest accidentally referred to Caligula as His Liquid Majesty during a public prayer, and was reassigned to a temple in the mountains where the sea could not follow. That winter, several junior scribes attempted to update the imperial records with the new aquatic victories. They were instructed to quantify the tides subdued and calculate annual fish yields. One particularly sincere bureaucrat named Sextus Levinus spent 3 weeks trying to weigh a sample of fog for reporting purposes. His report, titled Approximate Mist in Cubits, was never officially published but became popular in certain literary circles 2 centuries later. And then there was the festival. In celebration of their victory over water, the imperial court held a triumphal game series in the palace baths. Contests included synchronized splashing and interpretive puddle wading. A donkey named Antonius Maximus won the backstroke, having fallen into the pool by accident and paddled heroically for 7 minutes. He was given the rank of primi equus and a laurel wreath soaked in lemon juice. No one could explain the lemon juice. It was during these festivities that the first rumours reached Rome that tides had returned to Britain. Apparently Neptune, or perhaps just the planet's normal axial rotation, had struck back with high waves and impassable fog. Scouts sent to verify the unrest were last seen buying wool cloaks and muttering about giant crabs. Caligula called for a war council and accidentally included a tax assessor from Hispania, who recommended levying the ocean rather than invading it. The idea was taken seriously for almost a full day. By now, much of the empire had quietly accepted that their emperor was in conversation with the gods, and the gods were not particularly coherent. The pages of official decrees began to include footnotes of gentle contradiction. One read simply, "This order applies unless contradicted by thunder, east winds, or goats in peril." And so the dream marched on, across maps no one had drawn, against enemies that gleamed faintly under moonlight, and rolled in with the surf. Rome still stood, but its chronicles had begun to shimmer strangely at the edges, as if uncertain whether to record divine conquest or the nation's longest inside joke. Somewhere, in a locked drawer beneath the Senate floor, the original declaration of war on the sea lay folded inside an oyster shell. Why it was there, and how it smelled faintly of vinegar, remains the subject of one surviving poem and 3 bureaucratic investigations. Naturally, once the initial exhilaration of vanquishing the surf wore off, logistical questions began to surface. For instance, how exactly does one commemorate a victory over a non-sentient, constantly moving liquid entity? Standard practice would suggest a triumph, or at least a parade, but it was hard to fit waves into a chariot. Undeterred, Caligula ordered an official triumph through the streets of Rome, complete with wagons piled high with shells, bits of driftwood, and 2 moderately confused starfish mounted on poles like war trophies. The crowds cheered with the particular enthusiasm of people who are simultaneously baffled and afraid of being executed. Accompanying this aquatic victory march were a new cohort of honorary titles for Caligula. His preferred one, which he insisted on with increasing frequency, was Conqueror of the Ocean, although he also trialled Lord of the Shoreline and briefly Supreme Commander of the Squid. This last title was scrawled hastily on several banners before being mysteriously retired after a misunderstanding involving a fishmonger, 3 crates of spoiled mackerel, and the unfortunate fate of Senator Lentulus, whose lifelong fear of mollusks was brought to an abrupt and explosive conclusion. To further cement his maritime supremacy, Caligula announced a new tax on sea breezes. The rationale, if it could be called that, was that since Rome now owned the sea, it therefore also owned the air that passed over it, especially if that air dared to enter Roman lungs. Gauging the precise location of these breezes proved troublesome, so tax collectors began following fishermen inland, holding up ribbons to catch the wind and demanding payment from whoever looked guilty enough. One elderly widow in Capua was fined 3 times in a week for suspiciously draughty curtains. Even the gods, it seemed, were not exempt from Caligula's spiral. Neptune, inconveniently intangible and characteristically silent, became a scapegoat for everything from poor fishing yields to slippery bathhouse accidents. Caligula's priests began conducting full exorcisms on puddles, waving incense and muttering Latin invective at bird baths. Holy water itself was declared suspect and briefly replaced with imported olive oil, which did wonders for the skin but turned every fountain in the city into a greasy hazard. Public life became an elaborate choreography of slipping and polite denial. In the midst of all this, a new figure emerged from the imperial court, Decimus Fabius Cuculus, the recently appointed Admiral of Inland Bays. His title was invented on the spot when he brought Caligula an unusually symmetrical oyster during a morning audience. Unfortunately for Decimus, his name, Cuculus, translated to the Hooded One, which, due to a clerical misspelling, made its way onto state documents as the Damp Hood. He embraced the error with weary dignity, patrolling ornamental ponds in a specially gilded canoe, wearing an elaborately embroidered rain-cloak that had never once been in the rain. Meanwhile, the soldiers who had once clashed heroically with the shorelines found themselves reassigned to less glorious duties. Some became imperial beach sweepers, ordered to defend Rome's new maritime borders from driftwood, flotsam, and overly affectionate gulls. Others were tasked with enforcing the new edict banning storm clouds from entering Roman airspace. This led to several deeply awkward interactions between legionnaires and completely indifferent weather. Word of these events, as you might imagine, travelled. In Alexandria, philosophers engaged in frenzied debate about whether waves could, in theory, surrender, and what diplomatic terms might look like for a liquid. A noted Stoic penned an entire treatise titled On the Obedience of Salt Water, which was largely ignored except by one dramatist who turned it into a tragically moody puppet show. Unsurprisingly, the production was shut down after 3 performances due to complaints from the Roman Fishmongers' Guild, who found the final act, that included a weeping octopus soliloquizing on loyalty, frankly implausible. Back in Rome, a growing faction of bureaucrats attempted to steer the chaos into something resembling policy. One junior scribe, Lucilla, proposed that the sea might be governed through correspondence, beginning a surreal epistolary campaign in which formal scrolls were launched in bottles toward the open ocean. Replies were pessimistically anticipated. One scroll returned, soggy and unreadable, but was triumphantly interpreted as a formal acknowledgement of vassalage. It was later discovered to be a discarded clam recipe from Massilia. As summer wore on, the capital's fountains began to gurgle with citrus-scented vinegar, following another's decree that the sea should be tangy enough to command respect. This led to a series of minor injuries among the ornamental fish population, and one memorable incident in which a child named Gaius Minor attempted to poach a carp mid-festival using a lemon wedge and a soup spoon. Caligula, upon hearing the story, reportedly laughed for the first time in weeks, though he ended the moment by insisting the boy be named High Inspector of River Discipline. At the fringes of the empire, garrisons began receiving contradictory orders. One command instructed them to prepare for possible incursions by hostile merfolk. Another ordered the immediate construction of underwater watchtowers, which turned into a mysterious game of civil engineering telephone and resulted in a hillside fort shaped like a scallop. The commanding officer, who was from inland Illyria and had never seen the sea, proudly declared it was based on divine geometry and personally painted it green. It collapsed within a month. In court, the sea's conquest remained a central theme of everything. Senators attempting to pass even the most routine decrees, such as grain distributions or tax adjustments, were forced to preface their speeches with ceremonial oaths swearing allegiance to Caligula, Rome, and all their maritime properties, including rivers, estuaries, forecastle dreams, and the unsalted depths. One elderly senator simply pretended to faint to avoid reading the list. He later claimed divine fainting rights, and was left alone. And yet, amid the bureaucracy, the vinegar fountains, the soggy scroll diplomacy, and the increasingly eccentric fish titles, a curious sort of logic began to settle in. Once stripped of linear cause and effect, Rome's relationship to the sea drifted gently into myth. A myth in which oceans bowed, waves trembled, and even tide pools held their breath when a Roman approached. People began to believe because it was easier than questioning, or perhaps because, deep down, everyone likes a good story about a man yelling at water and winning, or at least pretending he did. And somewhere along the banks of the Tiber, overlooked by a half-clothed statue of Poseidon dressed inexplicably as a Roman senator, a pair of children argued fiercely over whose turn it was to wield the sacred whisk, the ceremonial tool used for banishing puddles. The elder child insisted she was Neptune's grandniece. The younger claimed legal ownership of the sea by inheritance, citing a shell with his initials carved on it as proof. Some myths, it seems, are sticky, some never make it to parchment, and others are accepted quietly, like the breeze from an ocean just out of sight. And so the furious war against the sea drifted to an awkward silence. The tide advanced and retreated without comment, offering neither surrender nor negotiation. The soldiers, armour rusting lightly from salt spray, stood ankle-deep in surf, unsure whether they should pursue the enemy into deeper waters or write it a strongly worded scroll. Instead they gathered seashells, baskets of them, pink ones, spiral ones, a few with tiny holes already bored into them, as if Neptune himself had pre-chewed the tribute. Some soldiers grew competitive, awarding themselves imaginary medals for the largest or most oddly shaped shell. One centurion insisted he had discovered a royal barnacle and refused to share it. Another tried to fashion a trident from 2 javelins and an asparagus spear pilfered from a camp cook. In the absence of meaningful orders, morale was inexplicably high. Caligula, meanwhile, observed the chaotic triumph from his portable throne, which had been set up with ceremonial cushions and at least one taxidermied flamingo for atmosphere. He declared victory over Neptune, retrieved the finest shell from the collection, a slightly cracked scallop with a suspicious smell, and announced it would be installed in the Temple of Mars as a symbol of Roman domination over aquatic forces. This caused some confusion among religious officials, who were already struggling to explain why last week's sacred goat was wearing a toga and being referred to as consul. No matter. A parade was ordered. The conquered shells were packed into wagons with the pomp usually reserved for enemy spoils, and the soldiers marched back to Rome, sunburnt, confused, mildly exfoliated. They would tell the tale of their battle to their families, who would nod slowly and spend the next decade pretending it had never happened. Rome, of course, did not collapse immediately after this. It would take several hundred more years, and quite a few weirder emperors, to truly wear down the edges. But this particular moment, when the most powerful empire on earth declared war on a category of weather, tends to linger like a weird dream you sort of hope was real. Some say the shells, those sacred offerings to a made-up victory, were never enshrined at all. One theory insists they were quietly dumped into the Tiber River one night, tossed over the side of a barge by a junior priest who had finally had enough. Another claims they were used as paperweights in the Imperial Bureau of Agricultural Drainage, which seems frankly offensive to both agriculture and drainage. There is at least one account from a minor senator's diary, suggesting that for a time a particular shell, a long spiral conch that smelled faintly of regret, was used as a ceremonial speaking horn during debates. This, supposedly, was short-lived, after it gave a rash to everyone who handled it. Caligula himself moved on. Within weeks he had shifted focus to other divine crusades, including appointing his favourite horse as a priest, possibly a consul, and definitely at least once a dinner guest. The horse, known as Incitatus, was given a marble stall, a gold necklace, and probably more political influence than most of the Senate. To be fair, Incitatus never tried to pass a new tax, which made him unusually popular. Eventually, the emperor's increasingly creative governance decisions prompted his close advisors to consider early retirement on his behalf. In the year 41, Caligula was relieved of duty in a brisk and persuasive manner, involving several daggers and no follow-up interviews. His reign, in retrospect, left behind a scattered legacy. Temples were built, statues destroyed, and somewhere, in the vague bureaucracy of Roman record-keeping, an official military campaign against the sea remains catalogued alongside real wars with real casualties, except that in this case the only casualty was basic dignity. Still, there's a certain peace to imagining that scene. Thousands of battle-hardened soldiers standing motionless in the surf, saluting the horizon and dropping to one knee to gather seashells like giant, heavily armoured children on a beach vacation that had gotten deeply out of hand. The quiet clink of metal armour mixed with the rhythmic sigh of waves. A seagull, probably very confused, picking at someone's unattended helmet. Somewhere behind them, Caligula nodding solemnly, truly convinced he had mastered the ocean. And perhaps, just for a moment, it decided not to argue. So if you ever find yourself on the Italian coast near Gaeta, and the breeze feels a little too dignified, the waves break a little too politely, take a moment to nod in return. You're standing on the battleground of a war that never made sense, where the forces of Rome did battle with salt water and lost to the tide. Good night.